Today, we're going to be talking about competency approaches to building a robust geoscience workforce. The whole concept of competencies is a bit of a buzzword, and what I'd like to do is sort of lay out how we want to approach this discussion. I'm going to cover these first four key points, really mostly background. We've been following the issue and the development of competency approaches in STEM in higher ed for about the last 7 years, and observing things that are going on. We're starting to see some of these ideas come into the geoscience arena. And then Heather, my colleague Heather, will be talking about a study, NSF-funded study that looked at geology and geography terminal masters and their alignment with workforce outcomes. And it was interesting in the sense that it mapped pretty well into a competency lens. So first of all, I want to talk about what is a competency when this topic comes up. And to be honest with you, one of the best definitions has come from the U.S. Department of Labor. One of the key things to understand here is that they're boiling it down as a set of related knowledge and skills that can be demonstrated in an actual task or a work setting. Now, this definition that the Department of Labor has been using is trying to bridge a very, very wide range of the workforce spectrum, all the way down to a technician level, all the way through senior professional. So therefore, it touches on a number of areas, and this is often an issue people get hung up on when they're talking in the higher education arena, and we'll talk about some of those nuances. One of the things that we have learned that there is a issue of language in the use of the word competency, and this came at a meeting a couple years ago where all the native English speakers were pushing back, I would say, on the concept of competency approach in the geosciences. And really what it was, and it was brought out actually by a vice president at Total, that if you look at the word competency and how it's used in English, it's really about a very finite skill, a manual skill in essence concept, using a screwdriver. But if you look in a lot of languages, in French in particular, it actually is much more about a knowledge bundle, a mastery of a concept, such as, say, creating an accurate geologic map. And so, there was a lot around of conversation about this discrepancy, and it's been interesting to see in the last couple of years that perhaps this, cultural language conflict has been subsiding a fair bit, and we're seeing this more broader application of the word competency, I think, accepted in places like England, Australia, the US, and Canada. But I think one of the key things that came out, and this was a meeting that AGI hosted several years ago, was that the scope of a competency could be widely varied. So it may be in a particular case that using a screwdriver is one competency and creating a geologic map is another, and they may be listed as on par. And so understanding that perhaps the technical intellectual level of any given competency may not be as comparable to the other, but it's actually about the aggregate portfolio. One of the key things also that is driving, and I'll talk a little bit about this, is the fact that when you look at the geoscience workforce right now, lifetime learning is becoming absolutely critical. If you're in the environmental sector, energy sector, mining sector, ongoing, and obviously in the government regulatory arenas, ongoing education is a key component. And one of the other things that we've been seeing through time, perhaps when most of us came out of school, the idea you finished your degree, formal education, was a bench point. You went into your professional employment. There was sort of they matched fairly well. There were some deficiencies, but it wasn't necessarily that big. But certainly the feedback that we get from employers is that gap is widening, and there's a lot of reasons on both sides why that gap on the technical side is widening. But also there's a lot of these other parallel issues, such as professional skills, things like ethics, business processes, communication, things like that, which are deficient from the employer standpoint. But also there's important issues such as licensure, regulatory awareness. We do hear this quite often of students coming out of school wanting to work in the environmental sector. They're missing some key certifications, for instance, that really don't fit into the formal university education approach. And so one of the key things is in a competency approach, which we'll look at, you get the student actually trying to look at this not as endpoints in education, but as a continuum. So one of the things that was interesting at the EAGE meeting was Total discussed they're using a competencies approach for career management in their staff, and this I thought was an interesting case study. So what they discovered that out of about 15 years of employment in the company, people that had moved into the senior geoscience management or in the geoscience technical area, there was a fair bit of attrition, and they tried to understand why. And what they did is they had polled these individuals and found that in a lot of cases, the people that were unhappy in management positions really had wanted to do more technical work, and the folks on the technical side perhaps were wanting to do things more on the business side. And so they actually went through a lengthy process and had individuals that were both happy and unhappy in their career map out, in essence, the skills and experiences that they had since they left school. And what they found was that individuals that were unhappy ended up having career trajectories that they had skills and the like that sort of bounced between these two trajectories. It was pretty ill-defined. They also found that as people got through their early part of their career and perhaps were on these transitions, they started thinking about what was senior management or senior technical positions, but they actually didn't really understand what those jobs and those career paths entailed. And so what they've now been able to do by mapping out the competency model is let individuals more directly manage their own development, understand actually what are the kinds of work that they're going to be doing at later parts of their career. The other thing that was interesting was they worked out with BP, and my understanding with EAGE and to some level the Geological Society of London, that through continuing education courses in the societies, and in the case of BP, continuing education that they provided their staff, that they could all map across into these competency fields, because Total had found that their staff were sort of bouncing to and from BP and Total. So this actually allowed ongoing career management seamless of where an employee was at a given time. So it was a nice application looking at this, and provided much better understanding for the for the professional about where their career actually was going. One of the other big issues that is brought up is competency mastery, and this was something that I've seen tackled a number of cases. In the case of Total, one of the things that they leveled out was competency was about a fundamental knowledge and understanding. One might equate it to someone passing a formative assessment in a university or continuing education course, that they could demonstrate that they understood the idea, but not necessarily have had a chance to demonstrate that they can apply it in a different context. Mastery in this case, and the way that they did in their career development process, required that an individual demonstrate the application of one of these competencies in an actual application, generally not in a isolated context just about whatever that skill or knowledge was, but into some kind of a bigger system, and that someone else that was recognized as having mastery of that skill, basically as asserting that that individual had demonstrated this process. So there was some additional growth potential and process in this development. And part of just sort of this overview, there have been some very interesting applications that I've heard case studies on of taking competency approaches. One which was very interesting, University of Utah Medical School. I was at a talk where they're just discussing this, and the question they posed was, what does an 80% in a medical school course actually mean? Is 80% mean that the individual sort of knew everything? Or does it mean that 20% of the things they didn't have a clue? And they started recognizing that this could actually be a very serious issue for patient outcomes. And the example that they put forward as two specific competencies that they did was the ability for a person to execute successfully a specific kind of surgical knot versus understanding the pharmacology of a specific class of medicines. because their point was you may be a crackerjack surgeon, but then you might kill your patient in the follow-up medication, or vice versa. You may be a great biochemist, but then the person might be leaking. And so what they did is they started requiring individuals to actually demonstrate competency on every single point within the curriculum, in essence, a large rubric throughout the whole course of study, rather than just looking at passing of courses. Now, Northern Arizona has selected programs, a number of them in their IT computer science area, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, in economics or communications as well, where they have taken on a competencies approach. So people are still bundled up in courses, but the demonstrable competencies, again, you could sort of identify them as curriculum outcomes in a rubric, are previously identified. But what's very interesting about this approach in these courses is that they allow the students to request their transcripts to be either laid out as a competency matrix or as a traditional course structure. And they found that a lot of the sort of the new generation employers like Google, Facebook, things like that have come in recruiting really did prefer the competency matrix approach. They're very interested in understanding what the students actually know and have been exposed to, rather than trying to interpret the course structure. What was interesting, though, this has also led, and when you have these competency structures, to move to a goal-based versus a time-based learning. So in essence, completion of the program was about actually successfully demonstrating every single one of these competencies in the program, rather than that you spent X amount of time, maybe got a 82% across the entire course of learning over 4 years. Now, this led to some interesting circumstances for them. Returning students that had come in with some experience were able to test out on a number of competencies, and therefore effectively test out of some classes. There was, some sense that was an okay thing, as long as the assessments were the same as students taking the class. The other side, though, was the competency-based approach became sort of the premier class. So students that failed, and I believe it was 3 times in their assessments on specific competencies, were then actually removed from the goal-based approach and then shifted to back to the time-based, semester course kind of approach. So an interesting application and direction. The folks at NAU that were presenting on this, they indicated there was exploration about trying to expand this more at NAU, but that was about a year ago, and I don't know where they stand and if this has moved on to other courses of study. One of the things as well, when we hear the discussions about competency approaches is this a threat or an improvement? Is this just the latest little fad? And what I really find is that academic, departments and faculty and students' perspective is that it's more of a threat. It's a big change. It does represent a geometric expansion of potential points of failure. You may be going from, having, 60 courses that you have to pass to perhaps 300, smaller assessments that you actually have to get through. Obviously, that adds a very different dynamic. There are serious challenges if one is to make a decision to go to a goal-based approach rather than a time-based approach. That certainly goes counter to most administrative structures. Certainly is not exclusive. You don't have to go goal-based in a competency approach, but it does become a logical outcome. And then I think this is a very, very real concern. I've heard this expressed in the geosciences and other STEM fields, is how do these kinds of approaches actually align in graduate school preparation? And I think that's a very serious concern. I don't think that's something that has been fully rectified. From the employer's perspective, generally I get feedback on that they like this when they see it. Biggest thing that they all like to say is they're able to assess a new hire's background. The trend towards fluffy names for courses is a big challenge for employers, rather than some of the old traditional standbys. It's becoming harder and harder to interpret what a course might cover. The other thing too, and this was brought up, to me, actually by some colleagues in Portugal, where they have very strict employment laws, and it's very hard to fire people, therefore they're reluctant to hire, is, to understand that employers hire people to succeed. It's not a punitive environment. And if they actually have a better understanding of exactly what individuals have in their capabilities, they can assign them activities to succeed right out of the get-go. And if there's deficiencies that need to be addressed as they move into other activities, that's fine. But it's actually being able to go and understanding exactly how to deploy their human talent. And one thing that's also been brought up, and this is happening mostly in Europe, it's providing an easier way to provide feedback to geoscience programs about what seems to be working and what's not. So some of the things that we're been hearing, or sort of, is a question about whether the potential, just sort of in the total approach, this is potentially a mechanism to empower students to self-manage their careers from their start. They start thinking a lifelong learning approach rather than the idea of formal education, sort of benchmark and then moving on. And obviously they get to better understand, they can think about their career prospects and understand what the proper preparation actually is that's required for that. I think the other thing, we've covered this in previous webinars related to the ad hoc committee on classification of programs, is this is another potential approach for geoscience programs to actually demonstrate their strengths. Perhaps they're strong in a specific discipline area focused on the petroleum sector or mining, or perhaps graduate school preparation, or liberal arts preparation. These are all terrific things, and this is actually a way to actually help demonstrate this is the kind of portfolio of understandings and knowledge that you will get. The other thing that's interesting that I've run into in the last couple of years running a few workshops is feedback from folks that have gone out into the employment sectors and have witnessed some of the layoffs that we're seeing right now. There's a lot of churn, largely because of overinflated salaries over the last couple of years. But what is making people resilient in employment? And it's really hard to say that with a specific degree or specific classes, but really the two big things is people that actually had computer programming experience, demonstrable, applied, they could demonstrate it, and people with advanced mathematics and could actually apply it. These have seemed to have been two factors that are helping folks, in the energy sector that are seeing some of the downturns continue to find employment because they're being lane shifted within their organizations. And this leads on to this whole issue of helping students manage expectations as we go through these cycles. And, energy is down, mining is struggling a little bit, but environmental is still booming. And to understand sort of where their portfolio of knowledge and skills are to apply to perhaps the realities of the moment when they come out of school and are starting to look for a job. I just want to highlight a few key efforts that have occurred in the U.S. Point you to the U.S. Department of Labor's careeronestop.org. Department of Labor about a decade ago made a massive investment in developing industry-focused competency models. They invested, I believe it was somewhere on the order of like $12 million into the geospatial competency model, and it took the better part of a decade to produce. These are very long, arduous processes that brought the academic community and the industry community, government community together to identify what people needed to understand, and not a prescriptive kind of thing, but what are the potential things they need to understand, and that certain portfolios would fit certain employment opportunities. Unfortunately, during that process, the Geosciences were invited to participate, and we walked away as a community because we did not want to deal with the fact that the Department of Labor needed this to be all the way from the basic technician level all the way to the senior professional. So that vertical industry scope was a challenge, and so therefore we don't necessarily have those resources, but we certainly have great models that we could build as a community if we decided to proceed forward. I also want to point out the Undergraduate Geoscience Education Summit series that Sharon Mosier at University of Texas has been shepherding through with great success, I believe. She's had two. There's another one coming up. In fact, she will be our speaker at our next webinar And one of the outcomes that we're seeing there is discussion about how do you frame, a lot of our programs in a competency-based approach to inform how the curriculum should be built and taught. So, it's very interesting to see these things continue to pop up. And there's lots of grassroots efforts that we're seeing that touch the geosciences in this, but these are some of the bigger ones that we've seen right now. So when I talk about the competency model for that the Department of Labor developed, so this is actually the pyramid that, and you can see the levels that are required in the development of these Department of Labor competency models. And within each of those categories is, dozens to, in some case, hundreds of very specific skills or knowledge elements. They actually have a few, believe it or not, that tap right into the geosciences. I mean, they have the idea of analyzing and interpreting, geologic data from a core. They also have things like determine ways to mitigate the negative consequences of mineral dust dispersion. Again, these aren't things everyone's going to have, but the idea that these are things that impact people that work in a geospatial data environment, and these would be the kinds of things that might define part of a career. But there are others pushing forward in the geosciences outside of the US. I think the group that's probably farthest ahead is Geosciences Canada. They've built their competency profile for entry to practice. It is heavily informed in the licensure structures that are up in Canada, but they do have some very good work done on core understandings of it for a geoscientist. They have a PDF report that lays all of this out in quite a bit of detail, available on their website. I strongly recommend taking a look at it. It has taken them a long time. It's been a substantial amount of work, and we're seeing other groups. So the Australian Institute of Geoscientists has started to take a look at the Canadian model to augment their own licensure structure, because they too have many of the same issues and are trying to make alignments. We have seen plenty of evidence that within the EU, particularly outside of the UK though, industry directly talking to the academic departments to encourage a competency framing of the degrees, because groups like Total and others are adopting this in their career management process. And then I'm part of a EU project called International Raw Materials Observatory, and we just had a meeting, and we had individuals from about 20 or 30 different countries. And I thought what was very interesting, folks from academia, governments, and industry, was there was a very strong call that we need to identify and establish this global core competency model in the geosciences, because the talent is so mobile. The applications are obviously pretty much ubiquitous in the discipline, and that this would be the kind of thing that there could be good collaboration efforts, because we are seeing, distinctive differences in the education, and it has been a challenge for the migration of talent, both from an employment and educational standpoint. So with that, it gives you some background. I'm going to turn this over to Heather Holton, who worked on this Career Terminal Masters survey and all the various components to that and how that fits in.
Great, thank you so much, Chris. Like Chris said, I'll be discussing the Geoscience Career Master's Preparation Survey. Oh. Chris, do you want to remain the presenter?
Yeah, okay.
Sorry.
That good?
Yeah, I can see it. Thank you. And this study was a collaboration between AGI and the Association of American Geographers, and it was funded by the National Science Foundation. And the purpose of our study was to investigate which skills and competencies are taught in geology and in geography programs. And we also looked at hybrid geology and geography departments as well, looking solely at the master's programs. And we wanted to understand what students are learning and how will these competencies align with how important each of these items are to the non-academic professionals for current positions. And so we specifically sampled master's programs which do not confer doctoral degrees and which do not intend on preparing our students to enter into those PhD programs. And the reasoning behind this idea was because traditionally we consider that the master's degree in the geosciences to be the professional degree for employment outside of academia. And it's the one that really yields the most opportunities for future career advancement in industry, government, and nonprofit sectors. And additionally, we sampled only faculty and students who are physical geographers. And so those in the geography programs, the ones who indicated that they were like the social or the human geographers were actually omitted from our data. So in our study, there were 3 sections of questions for faculty and students to answer. The first was about their experiences within the master's degree programs. And so these included questions about students' decisions to enroll in the program, their career influences, goals, and some of their opinions about the financial support available through their departments. The second set of questions investigated the non-technical competencies, otherwise known as soft skills, and then the third set looked at the specific technical competencies taught within the geology and within the geography programs. Next slide. Thank you. The geology competencies were developed from ASBOG's Task Analysis Survey. And the Task Analysis Survey from ASBOG outlines the most important competencies that need to be tested during their fundamental of geology and their practicing geology examinations. And so we use the industry best practices and their standards really to measure the competencies and preparedness in academia. And so the task analysis questions really reflect the most important competencies used by professional geologists. On the flip side, the geography technical competencies, as well as all of the non-technical competencies we'll cover, those were developed from AAG's EDGE program through their career planning survey for faculty and students. Next slide. The following describes how the survey inquired about each of these competencies. And so we asked faculty to report about their students or their advisees' preparation in each of these skills. So we weren't actually measuring the faculty's competencies, but rather their students. The students were asked to self-report on their own preparation in their master's degree programs. And the non-academic professional had a twofold question. First, we asked how much preparation they received in their master's degree programs in each of these skills, and then we asked how important each of these are to their current positions. And so I want to note that all of our non-academic professional participants, they hold master's degrees only. They are ones that did not pursue or finish a PhD or doctoral degree. Next slide. So circling back to what Chris just said about the geospatial competency model, I wanted to point out where on this graphic some of our competencies would fit in. And so you see the list of AAG's non-technical competencies, those kind of soft skills, they fit nicely within Tier 3 here. Workplace competencies, they're here in the red. And we had items such as creative thinking and teamwork within our survey, among some other examples, and then I'll discuss some of those with you shortly. The technical competencies for both geography and geology programs would fit both within Tier 4 and 5 in the yellow, and some of these are more specific than others. And so I want to clarify that only the technical competencies we investigated were different in the geography programs than those we inquired about in the geology programs. All of the non-technical competencies were the same for both populations. So now I'm going to move on and show you some of the results. So next slide. This first graph lists some of the examples of the non-technical competencies that we investigated, and it includes information management, writing grant proposals, time management, adaptability, and self-awareness, as you can see on the bottom axis. The graph shown here specifically is from only our geology program, so it does not include the geography respondents. But if we focus our attention to the bars in the red, orange, and yellow, we see that these represent the non-academic professionals' perspectives on how important each of these skills are to their current positions. And so we see time management and adaptability are the most important on this graph, and that writing grant proposals is the least important, as indicated by the yellow and orange bars right there. Next graph. This one reveals both that the relationship building skills and the computer and technology skills are also important for the non-academic professionals in geology careers. But more traditionally academic related skills, such as the teaching and the publishing, they're a little bit less important according to our sample population. But overall, if we were to present the full data set to you, which we don't have time for during this webinar, it would demonstrate that in our sample of geology master's programs, the skills which students were most prepared in, it really included making visual presentations, teamwork skills, and public speaking. However, the most important skills according to our non-academic geologists included writing, critical thinking, problem solving, time management, adaptability, and ethical practice, which some were presented here. So what we're witnessing is a bit of a competency gap between students' preparation and the most important skills in the workplace and within our sample population, which is pretty interesting. Next slide. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the technical competencies for geology. If you click once, thank you. Outlet here in the gold boxes, we see that the first and second competencies are highlighted. And the first one is plan and conduct geological investigations relating to human health, safety, the environment, regulations, quality assurance, and control. And so I want you to notice how unprepared students are for these particular skills, and yet according to our professionals, over 70% of them say that this is important or very important to their occupations. And so we see a similar trend for collecting and compiling and interpreting historical information to plan geological investigations, right there in the next column. If you click again, thank you. If we draw our attention to these last three skills, we find that the students are a bit more prepared, and the professionals indicate that these are actually, in fact, important to their positions. And these include interpreting and analyzing data, determining scales and distances from maps and imagery, and preparing and interpreting cross-sections, maps, and logs. So if you move to the next slide, I'm going to present for the geology technical competencies, looks at concepts relating to sedimentology and stratigraphy. And if you click, thank you. These three gold boxes highlight how well our geology master students are prepared in these skills. However, if you click, thank you. Notice how in the dark blue boxes, they highlight the non-academic professionals' perspectives on how important these skills are for their current positions. So overall, our data suggests that geology students are more prepared to work with, interpret, and manipulate a well-defined and a really nicely bounded data set, but they might be missing some of the more applied skills, which focus on understanding the full context of complex problems or even developing creative solutions. Next slide. In our geography respondents, we see that students are well prepared to use GIS to acquire and manage and analyze spatial data, which is obviously well aligned with how important this skill is for the professional geographers' positions. But if we look across the bar graphs, we notice that overall, the geography students have more extensive or adequate preparation in each of these items. And in the next graph, when we look at how physical geography students are prepared to apply their geographic information to political systems and processes or to culture, we notice that they have a little bit less preparation in these aspects, which actually accurately is aligned with how important these things seem to be for our professional geographers. And the most important skill for geographers, not surprisingly, is designing paper or digital maps, as you can see, and our respondents are pretty well prepared in that skill. So overall, there seems to be a little bit more alignment within the geography programs and the skills portfolios that employers desire in the workplace outside of the academy. So if we go to the next slide, here's a link if you are interested in viewing the whole report. You can download the PDF of our report for free, or if you would like a hard copy, you can find it online there. And I'm also in the process of creating resources in lieu of this research. So far I've developed survey templates for administrators and for faculty to evaluate their own programs. And these templates can be tailored specifically to fit your department or your program. So if you have any questions regarding the use of these survey templates, please don't hesitate to contact me. You can email me. My email address will be out there shortly. So thank you. That is all I have on my end. Oh, Chris, I don't think you're unmuted.
Thank you, Heather. If at this point, we can open the floor for some questions. I think Heather, you were going to go ahead and try to moderate these out.
Absolutely. Our first question, we had a comment about preparing students to be lifelong learners and to help them take a little bit more responsibility for their career preparation. But unfortunately, we noticed that a lot of our students kind of have a more narrow understanding of what is required. So the question deals with how do we help students purposefully go on in their careers and not let them avoid what they know is required if they don't like something like such as mathematics or something like that. What would you suggest, Chris?
Well, I think I think it's the combination through the whole course that like they've done with Total using a competency skills matrix kind of approach for that career management. That if we can provide students and say you're interested in doing a specific career track, here's actual hard. This is what the employers require you to know and understand for you to succeed at that job, and literally it's hard data. Um, I agree. It's hard with the students. Many are going to be trying to avoid some of those more difficult and challenging classes, but it can also provide them the opportunity to also look at what options there are if they really don't want to hit the more quantitative side. Perhaps there are other pathways that they want, but if they really do have a great desire to say work in groundwater hydrology, you got to do the math, and so that hopefully would be a motivator. I think if we can move it away from being you know purely just a faculty advisor telling them, imploring them, to also having some hard data behind it, I think that helps make the argument a little bit stronger. And it shifts some of the responsibility to the students, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing.
Okay, great. We have a question regarding the transition from a 2-year college to a 4-year college. How would you advise a transfer student from a 2-year college where competencies may not be used in that context to a 4-year college that does employ a competency type model? What would you suggest?
Well, I think that's a to be determined. I don't know of a specific examples of that. Though I think if you're transferring in a competency-based structure into a into a non-competency-based structure, assuming both organizations are part of ACE, in theory, the mapping should have been done so that a bundle of competencies should be equated to a course. That seems to be how people are managing this transition. I think these are the kinds of issues that the community, both as a discipline, but also the higher education community, are going to have to continue to grapple with.
Okay, and kind of along that same vein, how are the competencies written and by whom are they written?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the key thing, the model that the Department of Labor used, and this is also how it's worked in in Canada, is the basically the dialogue is hosted and facilitated by the professional societies, because more than anything, they can bring the maximum number of members of the community who can represent the widest range of interests and experiences to facilitate the conversation, and then bringing in a maximum input from the academic community and the industry partners. I know for the geospatial competencies, they got all the various geography and geospatial and appropriate computer science societies together early on, and they tapped their membership. The participation by the folks in academia was very good. They that side of it, sort of this is what we teach. This is how we educate. These are the things that we're seeing important. I know went relatively smoothly. And then they had, certainly some employers came forward and were constructive, but they spent a lot of time tracking down and making sure that they had a sufficient representation from the employer community and the regulatory community about what exact skills were needed. And I know most of their expense was actually spent in tracking down those groups and getting them to participate. So it's a very iterative process. It is a absolutely community-wide driven process, and driven, so the geospatial was driven through what I would say is broad community acceptance, and so everyone had had buy-in and shared in the development, and by and large the employers and the programs have used the resulting competency model as guidelines, and both from advising and curriculum development and hiring approach. So it is a wide community driven effort. I would see a similar kind of model. That's how Canada ran it, Geosciences Canada, bringing all the largest population of principals together to get their input.
All right, great. Now, how do we convince our department chairs and administrators to think a little bit more critically about this?
Well, I think my experience right now is this is an issue that sort of, I don't call it top down, but I'm hearing more when I'm at conferences and meetings that have chancellors and vice presidents of academic affairs and the like. They seem to be talking a lot more about these ideas, from the standpoint as far as policy, implementation policy, and then on the other side you have employers that are making investments into more technical programs, especially that might lead to 2-year kinds of degrees to help them do the mapping. I think to me it's a matter of identifying in our community, employers like Total that are using this as a career management approach. I think it's an advising tool to start with. Whether what the outcomes of the undergraduate geoscience education summit are, there seems to be a strong call that says we need to start circling around on something of this general construct to help strengthen our community as a larger entity. I think is a fair statement. I think that's probably going to be leading us down that direction, and obviously, with about 200 department chairs and the like at the first meeting, I would hope that we'll see that this, will continue to grow through time.
Now, do you have any information about how the Canadian university administrators, what they did and what we could learn from them?
Well, my understanding is this was a very quick turn. They had actually come through a sort of a classification accreditation process, for each of the university programs. I mean, one of the nice things they have is they have fewer universities, and so the heads and chairs group there is pretty cohesive. They actually are able to get together in one room and have conversations. So they had adopted sort of I wouldn't say a standard curriculum, but certainly standard guidelines. And then Geosciences Canada, at the get-go, they started realizing that wasn't going to be sufficient. And so my understanding at this point is they're utilizing and looking at the competencies for entry requirements as an advising tool and to inform their the specifics in their course design and content coverage. So I wouldn't say that they're moving to a strong competency model in the academic side yet, as far as I know. But it does seem to be, at least for a number of the schools, road signs to help their students move forward and to be better prepared.
Wonderful. I think those are all the questions we have so far. Are there any others? Again, if you would like to speak directly to us, and if you have a microphone on your computer, you can simply raise your hand, press that little hand icon, and we can unmute you, and you can pose your question directly to us as opposed to typing it in the chat box. And I'll give folks a couple minutes.
And as far as the questions, I see a couple of people asking if the slides will be available. Yes, the slides and the recording of this webinar will be available on our website in about a week. And we will be sending an email out to all the registrants about, that it's been posted. So we need about a week to get everything, squared away.
Wonderful. Are there any other questions coming in? I don't see anyone raising their hand or posting anymore in the question box. Oh, here we go. Here's a question about transcripts.
Mm-hmm.
How will the transcripts be arranged for competencies? Is it going to be like a pass-fail, or would they have letter grades? Do you have any insight on that?
My understanding is Northern Arizona University, you could call it a pass-fail. I mean, if you pass it, it is listed. If you fail it, it's not listed. Because in their program, they're going on this goal-based approach. So in essence, you can continue trying to earn that competency badge, shall we say, but you won't necessarily be dinged for failing at it, or in their case, after 3 times they shift you into a different program. So it's most of them are done on a badging process, so it's a binary kind of result. You either have it or you don't. That seems to be the primary approach to it.
We have one comment about remote sensing applications. I'm not sure if this is a particular question, but perhaps Chris, you might be able to talk to it. Remote sensing applications in the geosciences should be mandatory because the surface manifestations of geological structures involving natural resources and exploration and natural disaster prevention can be inferred. I'm not sure.
Well, I think if this is where the things such as the community process in developing these kinds of structures, as have been done in geospatial and others, come into play, where assertions like that can be put forward, and you can find out, you can get a feeling if there's a community consensus behind it, then it's the kind of thing that might be pushed down and noted as a core competency that people really would like to see everyone have. Which is how the Canadians have it structured. They have core competencies they would like to see everyone have, and then industry-focused or discipline, sub-discipline-focused, portfolios of additional competencies. So.
Great. Yeah. Now, does the traditional course transcript, do you think that would be kept with like the letter grades, or do you think there would be a movement to kind of change the entire system?
I think that's a to be seen. My understanding is groups that have gone to a goal-based system, the letter grades are gone. Because they pointed out in the talk that was presented about the University of Utah example, the path was mastery. I mean, it was an A. You had to be able to, in essence, ace that nugget of information or that concept, and so people were able to proceed, shall we say, out of sequence sometimes, and focus on spend more time focusing on those elements that they needed more time on, so they got, in essence, a high pass, shall we say.
Okay. Now, how have the accrediting bodies for universities responded to the suggested shift from the time-based system to more of the competency-based?
I don't honestly know, though. We're seeing more and more universities implement specific programs. Traditional universities specific programs. Doing this. So I assume that this has been an issue that's addressed. I do know most are. The analogy that I've heard a number of times is you're still delivering in bundles that are courses, and the competencies are almost elements that you might have in your grading rubric, and so that there seems to be a lot of mapping that's being done. So if it's a matter that so for instance, in the Northern Arizona University component, if you get, say, there's 20 elements that you're supposed to pass in this quote-unquote course, and you only get 18 of them, the next time around you don't have to take the whole course again, but you have to sit through the 2 elements and pass those the second time around. So honestly, I don't know. I think it's an outstanding question, and certainly something that needs to be looked at.